Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode in the A Fork in Time podcast, the alternate history podcast. Today, we are going to be embarking on a journey which is, to my knowledge, fairly unique in the history of AFIT, A Fork in Time. And it's a topic that is going to be broached by only two of us today. So it's a two-man plane, a Cessna, if you will. Although I guess all planes are manned by two people, even commercial airlines, for the most part. Regardless, poor airplane analogies aside, I am joined today by my co-host, Evan Buck.
Hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Evan. And I am joined by my good friend Kai McAllister, who, in his eagerness to get this show underway, did neglect to introduce himself. So...
Yes, indeed, I did. Hey, how's it going? Good to be back for another episode of A Fork in Time. And indeed, I am very excited to discuss this topic because it's a topic that is near and dear to both my and Evan's heart. And I'm going to toss it over to Evan, but I'm just going to begin and preface by saying this topic contains and is about a very specific blue blur. Evan, you want to take it from here?
Yes, indeed. I think you set me up there quite nicely. The topic we're going to be looking at today is of one of the more famous video game mascots, video game characters, and that is the blue blur himself, Sonic the Hedgehog. And even though this topic itself is going to be rather niche, I would imagine, for the vast majority of our listenership, I do think it's one that's worthwhile to ponder and think about because Sonic is, even on a broad level, a cultural phenomenon. He's kind of like the counterpart to, and for the most part, the rival to Nintendo's Mario. Of course, now in recent decades, it's kind of more of a partnership, I guess you can say, like Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games and whatever. But be that as it may, despite the niche nature of this subject, I still think it's a really interesting fork to look into. So the topic we're going to be looking at today is of a particular video game in the Sonic series that never in fact got released. And that is a game for the SEGA Saturn console called Sonic Xtreme. And like all good things in the 90s, it has to be stylized and hip and cool and unique. So it's not spelled extreme like the word E-X-T-R-E-M-E. No, it has to be just the letter X and then dash T-R-E-M-E. Sonic Xtreme. As I made reference to, this was a canceled game. It was never actually released when it was intended to, and actually was not released at all. After the initial success of the original Sonic the Hedgehog game for the Sega Genesis console in 1991, the co-creator and major developer, Yuji Naka, and other Japanese staff relocated to California to join a nascent division of Sega known as Sega Technical Institute. This was a developmental division led by Mark Cerny. Cerny aimed to establish an elite development studio that combined the design philosophies of American developers as well as Japanese developers. It was Sega Development or Technical Institute that had developed the sequel to the original Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. That was released in 1992. Although this game was very successful, there were some barriers. The language barrier, cultural differences, and some competing visions between the Japanese and American sides of the business started to create some rifts and some difficulties. Once development ended, Cerny actually departed STI and was replaced by a former Atari employee, Roger Hector. The American side of Sega then went on to develop a game called Sonic Spinball in 1993, and the Japanese staff on the other side of the ocean, with Sonic Team, they developed Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Sonic and Knuckles, both releasing in 1994. And nerdy side tangent on this point, Sega actually created a really interesting technology with Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles to where you were able to combine both of the games, and they thus created an entirely different game called Sonic 3 and Knuckles. And to this day, my mind is kind of still blown by that technology. I think it's pretty incredible and inventive what they were able to do with that. And Kai, to my knowledge, I don't recall there being another like cartridge-based system or something like this, at least in a major console that was released like this technology again. Does anything?
No, not to mind. The only thing that can sort of give vague premonitions is I think it's Four Swords on the GameCube, where you can integrate the Game Boy Advance version with the GameCube version and use them in tandem together. And I think maybe some Pac-Man games as well incorporated that feature. But again, that's not the same thing. And
Yeah.
it's the only roughly analogous thing I can think of.
Yeah, for sure. But like, yeah, it's very interesting technology, and you're basically able to take one cartridge and insert it into the other. I'm not explaining this very well, but you take both of these separate cartridges, which are separate games, put them together, and somehow the programming was able to work in that it made an entirely new game that was a combination of both of them. It was just, it was really interesting. So Sega of America and the Sega Technical Institute, they were operating as independent entities, independent from the Japanese side of the business. Relations with the Japanese were not always very smooth. Some of this conflict could have been attributed to or caused by the Sega president Hayao Nakayama and his admiration for Sega of America. There were some internal politics going on. It seems like Nakayama might have shown some favoritism to U.S. executives, and this fomented some jealousy amongst the Japanese side of the business. But there were also some counter reports that came out and said that actually Nakayama would harshly bully the Americans. Whatever was going on, it was pretty clear, and amongst video game historians, it was pretty well known, and the general public, that, the different sides of the business of Sega were openly feuding with each other. After the Sony PlayStation released in 1994, the vibes at Sega were pretty bad, because Sega, famously, one of their most famous marketing slogans is Sega does what Nintendo don't. And in 1994, if I recall correctly, they kind of reached like their high water mark in what would be known as the console wars. They controlled over half, around 55% of the console market in 1994. But the executives of Sega knew that they couldn't rest on their laurels, and the PlayStation was pretty bad news for them. This was a very important moment in gaming history, and they knew that the PlayStation would start eating their lunch if they weren't able to create a compelling system to counter that. So the pressure was on for Sega to deliver a new system with a brand new suite of compelling games to keep up with the competition. In another interesting, Sega was, for those who aren't very familiar with, the console wars and video game market in general, Sega was kind of the edgier, more innovative company. Nintendo was usually more of the play it safe, make games and console systems that worked and did their job well and would sell well, but didn't really necessarily innovate a lot. Sega had much edgier marketing behind it, and also they were a little bit, in order to compete, they were a little bit more freewheeling in their technological innovations. And so one of these was the 32X. Sorry, Kai, did you want to jump in on that?
I was just going to underscore that. You mentioned the console wars, and the console wars was a real conflict going on between the main console developers, but there was a proxy conflict going on as well, which I think is germane to this discussion, which is there was also a proxy conflict with regards to 3D platformers. Mm-hmm. And each genre and each developer had their own mascot. For Nintendo, it was Super Mario. For PlayStation, you could argue it was Crash Bandicoot. And then for Sega, inarguably, it was Sonic the Hedgehog. So this is the setting up why this game is so important. It has to do with the console wars, but it also has to do with the parallel conflict of the 3D platforming hero and who can, dominate who can have the most cultural hegemony going forward.
Yeah, no, and that's actually a really important point, because the game that we're going to be talking about here, Sonic Xtreme, came about as a result of Sega understanding that, well, like you said, Kai, the platforming space, these mascot video games, were starting to move to 3D, 3 dimensions. Up until this point, they were mostly limited to 2-dimensional games. And then you have Sony with Crash Bandicoot and, Super Mario with the Nintendo 64, Super Mario 64. That's not being released until 1996. But there's this knowledge that, okay, we're going to be eventually making this leap to the 3rd dimension. And Sonic is a series that really famously struggles with the transition to 3D, because if you've ever played a Sonic game, especially the 2D ones, the side-scrolling ones, you know that the developers of those games were able to create an exhilarating sense of speed, but also being able to make you retain control as the player. And that's very hard to do in 3 dimensions. For
those who are not inclined to understand the background of what a Sonic game entails, a Sonic game is essentially, when you distill it down, it's the same thing as like a 3D Mario game, but Sonic's gimmick, his trademark, is that he is fast, and his catchphrase, gotta go fast.
Gotta go fast.
So it's all about speed. It's all about speed and going fast, and the thrill that one gets when one plays Sonic games is in that portion of the game when you are at maximum speed. And indeed, to this day, one of the enduring criticisms of any new Sonic game is the degree to which the game prevents you from gotta go fasting.
Right, exactly. And so this is where, so with all that in mind then, Sonic Xtreme and the Sega Saturn, which was Sega's newest console offering, they were trying to get off the ground. Sonic Xtreme started development. It was supposed to be the premier flagship new 3D Sonic game for the Saturn console. But because we do have an episode to get to, I don't want to delve too much into all the nitty-gritty, super nerdy details. There were a lot of problems with this video game. There was a lot of office politics. There was a lot of crunch time with very strict deadlines. Crunch is a pretty famous industry term, especially in the video game industry, where you're basically forcing your development team to work inordinately long hours to be able to hit strict deadlines. So there was that going on. Development hell. Again, we're just throwing out a lot of the video game industry buzzwords, but this just development hell is this idea of you're encountering problems, you're running into issues during the development cycle, you're having to scrap concepts and start all over because certain things aren't working. You all of a sudden realize that the game engine you're running is not satisfactory to be able to bring about the vision for your game, so you have to, again, start all over. those kind of things. But the main issue, of course, was, as I've mentioned, immense difficulties with translating the sense of freedom of movement and speed that you get in a Sonic game to a 3D environment. It got so bad that developers were actually getting physically sick and ill. One of the lead developers, I believe, contracted walking pneumonia after working 16 to 20-hour days on the project. So this is pretty intense work that they're putting into developing and playtesting this game. Things looked lost, but there was a glimmer of hope for Sonic Xtreme when SEGA initially permitted the dev team access to the source code and game engine for another project that Yuji Naka, the co-creator of Sonic, was working on at the time back in Japan, Nights into Dreams. However, Naga was reportedly rather upset with this development. He wasn't asked for permission by SEGA, and he basically reportedly threatened to leave the company if the Sonic Xtreme team was permitted to keep using his proprietary engine. SEGA thus disallowed further use of those tools to the Sonic Xtreme team. With 2 months to go until the deadline to ship the game out, SEGA canceled the game. And instead, they rushed out a port of an earlier game, Sonic 3D Blast. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, well, Sonic 3D Blast, that sounds like it's a 3D game, so why would that be an issue? Well, despite its name, if you actually look up footage of it online, it's not actually a full, proper 3D game. Instead, it's rendered in what's known as the isometric perspective to give it the appearance of 3D. But it's just 2 dimensions, but with extra clothes, extra steps. It looks a little fancier, but nobody who actually is playing the game would be deceived into thinking that it's actually a fully 3D game. Especially if you compare that to Nintendo's offering that same year of Super Mario 64, which was a fully proper 3D game. Yeah, no, it just doesn't compare. Super Mario 64 blows 3D Blast out of the water. So, SEGA had actually commissioned the Saturn version just in case Sonic Xtreme was canceled. So, fortunately for them, they were able to have at least something to release in Christmas 1996 for Saturn owners and Genesis owners. But, in the end, this proved to be disastrous for SEGA. The Saturn ended up not having any original new Sonic game, much less a 3D one. And the Sega Saturn went on to end up being a commercial failure. While it did quite well in the home market of Japan, it didn't really sell well anywhere else. By August 1997, Sega's fate was almost sealed. Sony controlled 47% market share, Nintendo had 40%, and Sega had plummeted to only 12%. Sega's management continually shot itself in the foot with office politics, especially as we have seen with the Sonic Xtreme development cycle, and this significantly contributed to the company eventually being forced to exit the home console market entirely. They gave one last go of it with the Sega Dreamcast, which was pretty advanced at the time of its release and had a lot of promise, but Sony ultimately upstaged them only a few months later with the PlayStation 2, which was more advanced than it in pretty much every way. So Sega couldn't catch any breaks, and they ultimately had to turn into a third-party developer and no longer publish their own consoles. So, this brings us to the fork in time. We are going to be contemplating the possibility of an alternate timeline where Sonic Xtreme is finished and released as intended for the holiday season of 1996, to much critical acclaim, instead of suffering cancellation. The way that we do this is letting the development team continue to use the source code and engine of the Yuji Naka project Nights into Dreams. They were allowed to have that in our timeline, but only for a couple of weeks. So, with that fairly extensive introduction in mind, and hopefully we gave enough information for the non-tech inclined, non-nerd, non-video game enthusiasts to follow here. Kai, what do you think are some of the major implications of a Sonic Xtreme that releases on schedule and does pretty well for Sega.
Yeah. So I think we should start by addressing the elephant in the room, because there's lots of avenues that I know we want to talk about.
Yep.
But I think the most important one is as I said, the elephant in the room, which is, does this game have the potential? Does it have the ability, assuming that it is well made and that the development hell doesn't result in a unfinished, unfunctional, or dysfunctional game? Assuming that all of that is not true, the game works, the game is good, and the game is a commercial success. Is that enough to save the Sega console ecosystem?
Yeah. And before you keep going, I will just mention that if you want to get into this, dive into this rabbit hole, there have been a lot of like demos and like samples of Sonic Xtreme that have been leaked on the internet over the years. And I say Sonic Xtreme, I mean like the prototypes of the game. And so I'm just going to say, I haven't played it. I haven't like loaded it onto an emulator and played it myself. But from what I have seen, I mean, compared to video games now, like I would say it certainly seems very clunky and not very impressive. But they are also only prototypes, and I'm sure for the time, it would have been seen as pretty revolutionary at that time. They definitely seem to be on the right track in a lot of ways, and so I think if they were able to refine the vision, fully complete it, were able to have that before Mario 64 came out, or at least around the same time, I think it would have done reasonably well. But I just wanted to throw that in there. We do actually have...
I think so too. Yeah.
We do have videos. We do have... Yeah, we do have those examples. And I think the mock-ups and the concepts that I've seen shows that they were cooking. They were onto something, but it's just there was too much going against it to work in our timeline.
Absolutely. The only caveat that I would throw into that, and I'm going to, for the sake of the fork, I'm going to agree with you. The only caveat that I would give to that is, if you judge Sonic 06 by its opening cutscene, you would have a very misinformed understanding of the game's quality. All that to say that just because Sega puts out a good press release about the game does not mean inherently that the game itself is going to be of commensurate quality.
Very good point. Yeah, indeed.
For those where Sonic 06, I think, is universally regarded as one of the most hideously dysfunctional and complete garbage games ever created. Just for the simple premise, that it promised so much and delivered so little. So it's kind of...
Well, I mean, that game was also beset with development hell and a lot of bad stuff in its dev cycle. But unlike Sonic Xtreme, they didn't delay it. They didn't cancel it. They just decided to release it in its unfinished, buggy state. An absolute mess. And, well, it nearly killed the franchise. So we could talk about it for a long time. All of our problems with 06.
Indeed.
I do think there were actually a lot of great things and concepts in 06 that really could have been, if it just had more time in the oven, I think it honestly probably would have turned out to be one of the best Sonic games ever made. But because they had to rush it out for the anniversary, or they felt they had to rush it out for the anniversary, it just became an absolute disaster.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a victim of a game made for a specific deadline and then released very hastily without being ready. And as a result, what had the promise of being one of the best Sonic games is instead regarded as one of the worst Sonic games. So, it's a tragedy, and unfortunately, in 06's case, it was released, and so we are able to judge it on its merits.
Yeah.
Xtreme does not have that.
No.
Yeah.
Well, and I was going to say, not to belabor the 06 point too much, but 06's story is also seen as one of the worst stories. But I think it's kind of a sense of confirmation bias. It's like, not to spoil it too much or not to get into the weeds too much, but like there are some very infamous parts of the game's story that are widely despised. But I think because it's attached to a pretty bad game, I think that's a big reason why people hate it so much. I think not only would that have been refined with more time in the oven, but I think it would have been something where if the gameplay was good, but the story was a little weaker, it still would have been seen as a good game. Versus if you have a bad story tied to a horrible game, well, it just compounds popular opinion being extremely negative against it, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they go hand in hand in the same way that, if a Civil War era movie is released and all of the Confederates are wearing World War II Army uniforms, the story itself may be good, but the fact that the costume design is so out of whack is going to inherently mar the story. In the same way, you can have an outstanding story on paper, on the script, and then when the gameplay falters, you end up having a game that is perceived as bad on the gameplay front as well as on the story front. It's a trope, but it's very common in gaming, unfortunately, and in movies
for sure. So anyway, but getting us back onto the right track, yes, because if you couldn't already tell, Kai and I are extreme nerds about this, and we can talk for 2, maybe even 3 parts just on our own about all of our video game opinions and the ins and outs and the idiosyncrasies of, different games and whatever. We could talk about it for a long time, but we are here to only focus on mostly focus on Sonic Xtreme and the implications of this alternate timeline. So, I guess the main question, which you started to get into, Kai, is what does this do for the Sega Saturn and the Sega console ecosystem? Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's a fair question, but I will say if we do have a successful Sonic Xtreme, I don't think you can understate what that does for the Saturn. I mean, just one game is not going to entirely make or break a system. But I will say we can see the precedent in our timeline of how the lack of Xtreme really did significantly hamper the Saturn from the get-go. It wasn't the only reason why the Saturn didn't succeed, but it was certainly getting off on a very, very wrong footing. So in a similar manner, if you're able to not stumble out of the gate and just have a very strong start, then I think that would really help the Saturn be able to compete a lot better. In our timeline, do keep in mind that we did have issues. Sega was already in trouble in terms of market share. The 32X, which was an add-on for the Genesis, it had already failed, despite the 32X actually having its own original Sonic spin-off game, Knuckles Chaotix. Even though they had that, and even though there was initial positive reception for the 32X, it ended up being a commercial failure. So Sega was already far removed from the days of the Genesis doing what Nintendo don't. So they were under a lot of pressure to deliver. But yeah, I do think a successful Xtreme showing how Sonic could push the boundaries to 3D successfully, which was something that even Yuji Naka himself was very doubtful could actually happen successfully. I would say, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this would probably have saved the Saturn from its ultimate fate. Because if you remember in our timeline, it sold well in Japan. Sega, did very well in its home market. The Saturn did well in the home market, but didn't really do super well in America and in Europe. I think if you had because Sonic as a character, we also have to remember this as well, was modeled after a lot of trends and tropes of American culture. Even though he was a Japanese character created by Japanese developers, famously, a lot of his mannerisms and a lot of even his music was inspired by Michael Jackson, for example. And he was made to market to for the most part, a distinctly American audience, and he's still an extremely popular character here in the United States and the West. I mean, that's why we have SEGA of America. That's why we have, the SEGA Technical Institute developing games to bring the best of the American development mindset with the Japanese mindset. So, Kai, would you agree with my assessment that I think, although one game alone might not be enough, I would say that the alternate timeline Sega Sonic Xtreme would in fact have probably saved the Sega Saturn, or at least given it a much stronger footing to compete.
I would agree. And I would agree because although you are pitching it as a single game, it's important to understand what that game would have represented in the context of the time. And I think when we understand that, we can see why Sonic Xtreme being released to great acclaim would meaningfully impact the life cycle of a console, because it represents more than just another Sonic title.
Yeah.
At this time, right, when we think of video games, we don't even really distinguish between, this is a 3D video game. We don't think like that because it's just assumed, and we're all so, intimately familiar with 3D video games and 3D technology that we don't consider the fact that it was at one point a very novel technology and seen as like a game changer, right? Even more so than like VR, because VR, at least at this time, hasn't really taken off in the same way that 3D gaming has. So you got to put yourself in the time frame and realize, we've got 2D games, we've got these isometric games, which Evan mentioned, Sonic 3D Blast is one of them. And now we're starting to make the transition into an actual 3D game. And Super Mario 64 does it, and does it with flying colors. It's an outstanding game that is still played and loved and admired to this very day. And that game really set the standard for a whole new genre in gaming, which was 3D games. And so Super Mario 64, yeah, it's a great game, but it really represents something a lot more than just a game. It's a transition phase, right?
Exactly.
It is the transition between one world into another world. And companies that were observing this, and even before, when they knew that this technology was on the way, they were all in this race to develop the mascot that would represent the transition from 3D gaming, and land it in the same way that Nintendo did with Super Mario 64, making Super Mario the representation of Nintendo's transition from 2D to 3D.
Yeah, I mean, this is after Mario 64. This is when we kind of started that era of what some people call the cereal box mascot kind of games. You have like Banjo and Kazooie. You have Bubsy, who he had his own 2D games, and then he had his famous, hysterically awful Bubsy 3D on the PlayStation. But there were at least these attempts to break that new ground, because now the developers had to do catch-up work. They were like, oh snap, Mario 64 is incredible and set the standard. Crash Bandicoot, also a great 3D game. We got to now play catch-up work. Sorry, what was that?
I was just agreeing with you. Crash Bandicoot was another great one.
Right. And so, but the other one that I'm thinking of as well, there's Spyro the Dragon, and there's the one, it was like a crocodile. I forget his name though. But
Gex? Was it Gex?
No, that Gex the Gecko. That's different. You know what? I'm looking this up. Crocodile 3D.
I know what you're talking about.
I know, but it's kind of forgettable. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I'm not remembering its name.
Croc.
Oh, Croc. Yeah, there you go. I was overcomplicating it, but yeah, there you go. So you had this era where pretty much all major game developers were going into this mode of, okay, we need to make the next big 3D hit, and we're going to create a new serial mascot, video game character to be able to take on the Marios and the Crash Bandicoots. And most of them ended up crashing and burning, or like not being as memorable, or they might have found some degree of success, but again, they never got to be as big as Mario. And so if you have Sonic...
And the point of all of this
go ahead.
is that Sonic Xtreme is intended to be the game, Sonic's version of Super Mario 64. So in that sense, we have to think about it as... because the game never released, so nobody really is familiar with the game. So it's hard for us to imagine one Sonic game is going to change the trajectory of an entire doomed console franchise. Seems unlikely. But if you think about it in the context of this game is supposed to be the transition point between 2D Sonic and 3D Sonic, you can see how, in fact, the game has a lot more weight to it in the broader context of technology in the time.
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of hype surrounding it. There's a lot of anticipation surrounding it. And so to have it be canceled fairly last minute, and then, the consumers are tossed a relative bone of Sonic 3D Blast, which isn't a horrific game, mind you, but it's just, again, compare it to Mario 64. It is not in the same neighborhood. It's not in the same zip code. It just doesn't hold a candle. So, yeah.
No, it reeks of like an arcade game versus an actual or it reeks of a crappy soap opera sitcom versus Interstellar, right?
Right.
It's just not even in the
pretty
same
much.
ballpark.
Yeah, exactly. And so that really, I think, was one of the major pivotal events that hampered the success of the Saturn. And so, yeah, Kai, I think you say it very well. It's really not just one game. It's what that game represented, and then giving the confidence for Sega Technical Institute, and just Sega as a company writ large, to be able to continue to innovate, to continue to push the envelope, because that's what Sega really did best. That's kind of what made Sega Sega. So to have that be removed, as it was in our timeline, it just does a lot of harm to the company and to its development procedures.
No, I agree.
Yeah. So that actually leads to another interesting question, because if we assume that this is pretty successful, it helps Sega out considerably. Again, we set up a lot in the background in setting up the fork for a reason. Knowing the office politics of what happened with the doomed Sonic Xtreme in our timeline, all of that development hell still happens, but it leads to a successful product that gets released. So let's think about what this might have done in terms of good old-fashioned office politics. Because now we have the American side that released Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and released, the Japanese side was kind of really firing on all cylinders with Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles. But now the American side gets to strike back with a very successful and revolutionary 3D Sonic game. What do we think that does with office politics at Sega? Do we think that might lead to some sort of, resolution between the two sides? Or do you think this would maybe intensify the rivalry between the divisions?
It's hard to say for sure, given the fact that I don't personally know Yuji Naka, who I think is the main person around whom this office politics is orbiting. But it's easy to conceive of a world in which Yuji Naka, who, as I think you mentioned, was making very bellicose threats of resigning should his source code be handed over to the developers of Xtreme, we can envision a world where Sega declines and Sega continues to offer the source code to the Xtreme developers, and that so embitters Naka that he ends up departing from Sega earlier than he ends up doing in our timeline. And that, of course, could have profound effects, which I'm sure we should discuss. But in addition, I think we should also consider the fate of the succeeding Sonic 3D games and whether the office politics reveling the success of a successful 3D transition, which unfortunately Sonic never really got, and to this day we can still argue still hasn't gotten. And the first one, or the main one, I think it's the first one that comes out, is Sonic Adventure in December of 1998. And we can conceive of a situation in which those games, Sonic Adventure, either comes earlier or it comes at the same time, but it is better and more well received, and there's more fuel for Sonic Adventure 2, and then Sonic Adventure 2 now has more fuel for Sonic Adventure 3, a game which in our timeline we've never actually received. So I'm curious to see your perspective on both of those. Do we see an early departure of Naka, or does he, let bygones be bygones and accept the fact that his source code for his other side project, which, by the way, I would note, did actually release the Dreams into...
Nights into Dreams.
Sorry, Nights into Dreams did end up releasing, and the series is actually still around. It's not really a huge impact series.
Yeah, it's a very niche thing. Like, it's been well received, but it's not extremely popular. It's a very, only
inconsequential.
Yeah. In terms of cultural impact, very inconsequential.
Yeah. It's a great game series. It's a great game series. I've played a couple of them. They're good, not entirely, but like I've dabbled, and they're good games, but they're in no way as culturally impactful as Sonic the Hedgehog. So if you're wondering what happened with that series and whether that series ended up carrying the torch for Sonic, the answer to that is a resounding no.
No.
So if Yuji Naka is willing to let bygones be bygones, maybe he stays, or perhaps he leaves as he was threatening to do so. And in any of those scenarios, do you think that would have a effect on the office politics going forward? And then also, what do you think about the Sonic Adventure games? Do we get them earlier? Do we get them at the same time? And do we ultimately see Sonic Adventure 3?
Yeah. No, I think you present some really good questions there. So let's talk about the office politics first. And Yuji Naka. Yuji Naka certainly wasn't the only person that was heavily involved with the office politics. There was a bunch of drama going on, and even me, a pretty avowed, Sonic Sega fan, even I that's something that I probably want to read more about. I think there's some documentaries out about it too. It's very well documented, all the drama that happened behind the scenes. But that being said, in our timeline, he sticks around until, ironically, 2006, during the development of Sonic 06 and then Sonic and the Secret Rings. And that's part of why Sonic 06 turned out so terribly, is because half the development team for Sonic 06 split off to start making Sonic and the Secret Rings. But yeah, he leaves in 2006 in our timeline on fairly good terms with Sega. He basically just wanted to do his own pet projects. He kind of felt like he contributed the most he could to the series. But I don't think he takes this lightly, personally. I don't think he takes this standing down. By all accounts, he was very adamant about the Xtreme team not using his source code and his engine for Nights into Dreams. So if Sega overrules him, he just doesn't seem like the kind of guy to take that standing down. I think he takes that as a very deep personal and professional offense. And I think he hightails it, personally. I think he leaves Sega 20 years earlier in the alternate timeline and on decidedly bad terms, which I think is a very interesting world to contemplate, because in our timeline, he leaves, he makes a couple of games that, again, kind of like Nights into Dreams, they're, decently well received, but don't really sell super well, don't have a very big impact. And then I think he gets hired by Square Enix somewhere down the line. He makes an absolute utter travesty of a game called Balan Wonderland. Horrific. Absolutely
Yes.
horrific
Oh man, I
game.
forgot about that.
Yeah, no. When I heard he was behind that game, and I'm like, okay, this seems like it could be decent, could be reasonable. The trailers were pretty, like astoundingly gorgeous trailers, and I'm like, okay, this could go somewhere. And then I saw the demo and played the demo, and I'm like, oh dear, this is going to be horrible. And yeah, it turned out to be bad. If you're wondering where Yuji Naka ended up in our timeline, he ended up getting arrested for insider trading of Square Enix stock, I believe, and some shady stuff to do with crypto. So yeah, the co-creator of the Blue Blur did not have really a happy ending in our timeline. In this alternate timeline, I think it'd be really interesting to see him creating a new game studio and what the direction of the Sonic series would look like without him. That's, I think, a little bit too speculative, because it's hard to say exactly what he and his new team would have done 20 years earlier. What I think we can chart out a little bit better, though, is where Sonic goes from here. I would say that if we have such a resounding success that has come from the American side, then I think even the Sega of Japan people, and not the Sonic Team people, because remember, there's a distinction. Sonic Team is part of Sega of Japan. Sega of America is a separate unit. But I think even at that point that the head honchos at Sega of Japan are going to have to concede that maybe the Americans have the technological wizardry and know-how and understand how to bring Sonic into the 21st century coming up right around the corner, versus being more reliant upon the Japanese side and Sonic Team. So that would be interesting to see how that pans out. Because I think I'm gonna leave you room to comment on that, Kai, because I do have ideas for what that means for Sonic Adventure. But yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts on that. What do you agree with that? Disagree with that?
Are you talking about whether I agree or disagree with the Naka bit, or the handing over the reins to Sega of America, or both?
Well, I was going for both, but whatever you want to address.
I think everything is that you said is reasonable with regards to Naka. I think it's something that we can never actually know, because there's so many. I think the success of to potentially counter your point, I think that the success of Xtreme would have done a lot to assuage his bruised ego.
It very well
because,
could have.
Of course, he's seeing now the fruits of his labor. He's probably credited in the game. He's definitely credited in the game, and so I think that the success of that game would have done a lot to allay his concerns. But ultimately, it may have just been an ego thing, and that even the success of Xtreme is not enough to convince him to stay, and he does indeed depart. I think that that's very possible, and I think the implications for Sega and the gaming industry are more interesting if that is the case. With regards to whether Sega ends up turning over the reins to Sega of America, it's hard to keep track of all the terms.
It is a little hard to keep track
Sega
of
of America, Team Sonic,
the web,
Sega Japan, Sega, but if I think it's very likely that if Sonic Xtreme is a commercial success, guiding the franchise through the treacherous waters of developing a 3D launch title, and does so with flying colors, I think Sega of Japan is going to recognize that, the spark is across the Pacific Ocean, and they're going to hand the reins over to Sega of America, which, if I recall correctly, and I think an esteemed scholar of Sega history such as yourself will know the answer to this more than I will, eventually Sega of Japan yielded anyways, and basically said, Sega of America, Sonic is your deal, you take the reins from here. Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure the specifics of how that could be characterized. I know they heavily trusted the Sega of America folks with the development of Sonic Adventure. I would have to look more into specifics of if that's the case. I mean, Sonic Team is still around, and they do have a lot of, with Iizuka, they have still a lot of creative control over what happens with Sonic. But
well,
as I understood
as I understand it, Iizuka, who you just brought up, and is someone who I want to talk about in a little bit.
Right.
But as I understood it, he is part of. I don't want to say the wrong thing here, but I was under the impression that he was actually part of the Sonic team in the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not. I would have to research that a little bit more. But and the event that you're referring to about Sega of America becoming in charge of Sonic, I think that only happened like a few years ago.
Yeah, I remember us talking about it a few years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. But it was something that was more incremental over time. Like, it was kind of just over time, it yielded more and more until they kind of mostly took over direction of the franchise. But I think having that again happen like 5, 10, 15 years earlier would certainly have big impacts.
Regardless, the only reason why I bring that up is just to underscore the fact that I agree that extreme success would almost certainly hasten that decision and lead to a scenario where Sega of America or Sega Technical Institute takes over.
And if I remember correctly, in this timeline, or the original timeline, Sega Technical Institute folds, I believe. I believe it was dissolved in our timeline. And so Sega of America still exists, of course, but Sega Technical Institute was closed down after this. So the implications of the kinds of games that Sega Technical Institute would have created, not just Sonic games, but I'm sure they also would have been tasked with other interesting new series or titles as well. Again, a little bit too speculative for the course of this show, but would have been fascinating to see pan out. But the other main thing that you brought up that I think we should handle before we start wrapping up this episode is, what about the Dreamcast and Sonic Adventure? And, if we did really want to make a part 2, we could talk about the console wars playing out in a possible different way, what the PlayStation 2 would have had to have done, what the Xbox would have had to have done. We can probably give some parting thoughts on how Nintendo's hand probably would have been forced by a successful Extreme, but be that as it may. Talking about Sonic Adventure. Sonic Adventure was released, as you mentioned, in 1998, and the follow-up, Sonic Adventure 2, was one of the last games that was released for the Dreamcast. And, they were, pretty successful 3D platformer games. And they really helped define a new era of Sonic. This was really what brought Sonic into the modern world. Very cool, very hip, very edgy, kind of brand of Sonic. And they even changed his shoes, actually, to appeal better to American audiences, which I think is pretty interesting. So I think if Extreme is successful, then we are going to have, more Sonic 3D projects. We might have something either like Adventure or Adventure itself coming sooner. And so assuming that timeline and the development cycles and everything shifts up a little bit, then I do think it's just a natural consequence. If the Saturn is successful, it changes Sega's fortunes, and it thus leads to also some better innovation on the part of the Dreamcast console as well. I think it's a very likely chance that Adventure 3 happens. We even had Adventure 3 in pre-production in our timeline, during the Dreamcast era. Like, they started drafting the documents, they started getting it going, but because the Dreamcast failed, because Sega exited the console market, never came to see the light of day. And one could argue that A lot of future Sonic 3D games took a lot of bits and pieces that would have been in a Sonic Adventure 3 and incorporated them. Sonic 06, Sonic Unleashed, a lot of future 3D Sonic titles could be seen as like the spiritual successor to the adventure games, but we never did actually get that formal third installment. So I think, Kai, if we buy Sega a bit more time, if Saturn is successful, the Dreamcast is a little bit more successful, and Sega doesn't exit the console market when they do, then I think, I'm not going to say it's a foregone conclusion, but with the success that we did see even in our timeline of Adventure 1 and Adventure 2, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't get a continuation of that storyline in a formalized Sonic Adventure 3. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's very conceivable. It might be a case of a rose by any other name. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. That we don't get Sonic Adventure, we get Sonic Xtreme 2 and Sonic Xtreme 3 and Sonic Xtreme 4. It's very conceivable that that's the case. But as I said, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. It would still be the same game. We would still have the same, we would still have the same continuation of the series. And I think the whole series as a whole would be far more robust and more enriched as a result. Most definitely.
Yeah, for sure.
So we mentioned very briefly the character that I want to talk about next, and this is the last character that I want to talk about before we wrap things up. We mentioned Yuji Naka. We talked about him extensively and what his role going forward might have been. But the person who ends up becoming the most influential person in the Sonic universe is a man by the name of Takashi Iizuka, and he's been around for a while. And indeed, he still is the creative director for the Sonic series, which, by the way, I looked it up, and I was correct in that he works as the head of Team Sonic, and as of April of 2023, which I think corresponds to that news that we were remembering, as of that time, he's now the chief creative officer at SEGA of America.
Yeah, and that makes sense because, again, Sonic was kind of given over to SEGA of America around that same time frame. So that makes sense.
So all of that just to underscore our point about how it would have been handed over to SEGA of America earlier. Regardless, tangents aside, Takashi Iizuka has been the chairman of the Sonic Party for some time. And he has been the person making a lot of the creative decisions, for better or for worse. I know Evan has strong opinions on the man. For better or for worse, he's been making the decisions for SEGA of America. And the question is, all of his influences that have shaped the Sonic franchise, really since 06, all of his decisions, everything that he's done for the Sonic franchise, for better or for worse, really has brought Sonic into the modern era and made it into the franchise that we are familiar with. The question is, we have Naka in this alternate timeline. We have Naka departing earlier, and so does Iizuka take over earlier, or does someone else take over and preclude Iizuka from taking the reins? And what are the implications on the Sonic series as we know it today if we have either an earlier Iizuka assumption of power or no Iizuka at all?
Yeah,
What do you think,
I think those are some really interesting questions, and I'm gonna go out here and say I don't know exactly entirely how it would have panned out. I do think, just kind of reviewing and knowing what happens with Iizuka in our timeline, as you say, for better or for worse, I think he's done a lot of good for the franchise, but I also think there have been quite a few decisions and things that has done that has not been helpful for the franchise. But yeah, just looking at this situation, I don't know, and I'd have to review specifically in more detail, like, was he at, or would he have been at the right place, the right time, the right man for the job with Naka's departure? Would he just have been the heir presumptive? I don't know. It's kind of difficult to say. He was the director for Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2 in our timeline. So I think he would have still remained very influential, and in fact would have been probably made even more influential with Naka's departure. I could see a situation where extreme success is so extreme that we actually do see an American head. Not only is Sonic given to Sega of America completely earlier, but we could even see an American head of the Sonic franchise earlier, and having Iizuka work or report under him or be made the director of the games, but not like actually the head of Sonic as a whole. That I think might actually be a little bit more of a likely scenario. The only thing that would make me think that's not possible is the office politics still remaining a fairly big deal within Sega. And so that might be a bridge too far, even with Xtreme's resounding success. So Sega back in Japan might still want to keep things ostensibly in-house. But with all of that rambling analysis and speculation in mind, whatever happens specifically to Iizuka, I definitely think he stands to gain a lot in this alternate timeline with regards to his influence on the Sonic series.
Yeah, I think that's entirely conceivable. It's hard to speculate. I'm just trying to fish for a way to prevent the Sonic Boom franchise from coming into being.
Oh, dear Lord.
So any way that we can either mute Iizuka or in some way dissuade him from making that creative decision, I think is a timeline worth pursuing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's very possible that Iizuka assumes the reins, maybe not as like the creative director for Sonic writ large, right? Because he joins the company in 1992 straight out of college. So maybe at that point he's not quite ready to take the reins. But certainly, he's going to become he's going to be the heir apparent, as you so aptly put it. He might be the person who's being trained to take over the Sonic franchise as the creative director at some point. And so he would probably eventually come to that role, maybe not right at the point of Sonic Xtreme's release, but maybe a couple years after he's successfully, created a succeeding 3D Sonic games. And so we have him taking the reins earlier than he does in our timeline, which could have very interesting effects.
Indeed, for sure. But anyway, those are like the major swaths, the major brushstrokes that I think we have done pretty well in exhausting. I have some parting thoughts of my own on littler issues to tidy up that I think could be interesting implications to pick up moving forward. But before I get into those soliloquies, Kai, do you have any other areas of analysis or last minute things that you want to bring up?
Not that I could think of, except that, of course, I'm always perpetually amazed by how such small little things can have profound impacts, and how we're able to talk about something as niche as the release or lack thereof of a game. I guess one thing that I'd like to think about is the fates of some of the American developers who and what would happen to the Sega Technical Institute? Would its fate be sealed as it was in our timeline, or would we see it remain an entity of its own? All of these things I think are even harder to speculate. It's hard enough to say, would a specific person stay with Sega or would they leave? It's another thing entirely to say, would an entire branch of a company exist or not in some alternate timeline? But it's still something I chew on. Yeah.
I will say something that I learned in quick Googling about Iizuka's career is apparently fairly early on, he wanted to create a Sonic RPG, like a Sonic role-playing game, which didn't happen in our timeline until Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood, and that remains the only RPG I think that Sonic has ever done. And that's a whole nother fascinating rabbit hole that we can't get into. But just to make a very long story short, a lot of the characters and the plot and everything of Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood can't be used anymore because of a legal dispute with, I forget if he was like the main designer, like character designer or story writer or whatever that was in the Dark Brotherhood. He goes by Ken Penders. I have incredibly strong opinions about him, as does most of the Sonic fan base, and they're not altogether pleasant. I really do think he's holding the franchise hostage in a lot of ways. But be that as it may, that'd be interesting to see if like we got a sooner Sonic RPG possibly with little to no involvement from Ken Penders. Like what would that do for the Sonic franchise too? I honestly think it would have done the franchise very, very well, despite Chronicles, relatively poor reception. I think just the tone of the series and the characters and the story would have been a lot richer and a lot more, a lot different for the better in that possible alternate timeline. But yeah, I think I just had a couple other last minute things as well. The Sonic series didn't have like Hollywood level production movies until the 2020s. And those were very successful movies. Kai and I have seen all three of them, and they're coming out with a fourth one. But there was going to be a movie tie-in to Sonic Xtreme. And that was, of course, canceled because the game was canceled. But I think we probably would have seen that. And based on the premise of it, from the little research I've done, all indications to me would tell me that that movie would have done reasonably well at the box office. It does sound, the premise kind of sounds a little bit far-fetched, though, to me. Essentially, Dr. Robotnik, or who he's now referred to as Dr. Eggman, he would have been trying to steal the 7 wonders of the world or something like that, and Sonic was tasked with stopping him. So it probably would have done well in terms of brand awareness, but just from the plot alone, I think the movie would have ended up with a popular reception akin to the original Mario movie. And if you guys aren't aware of the original Mario movie, not the new ones created by Illumination, but the gritty, real...
The one Nintendo wants you to forget about.
The one Nintendo wants you to forget about for very good reason. I've seen it. It's so bad it's good kind of thing. Like, it's funny, and I bet if you're on certain substances, it's probably hilarious. But it's pretty awful. It's pretty bad. And so the Sonic Xtreme movie probably would have had a reception similar to that. But yeah, I think those are really the main things I wanted to think about and discuss. I think the only other thing, just small thing to mention as well, is what would have happened to 3D Blast? Because it was released for the Genesis, and if Xtreme releases on time, then we probably wouldn't have gotten the Saturn port of Sonic 3D Blast. And, that's not maybe necessarily a huge deal in terms of video game history, but I will say the Saturn version of 3D Blast has better visuals, it has lovely music, and I'm curious if it would have been one of those, it would have been the alternate timelines version of Sonic Xtreme, in that it was canceled and not released, but it would have been seen much more as a, prototypical kind of game, or we already knew we got the Genesis version of Sonic 3D Blast, so speculation would have centered on what would have changed, what would have been different, but it would not have been seen as, it's a huge loss to humanity that we didn't get the Sonic Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast,
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I think it's very possible that we would have actually gotten 3D Blast. It probably would have not been, or definitely would have not been, the Christmas release. But
No.
I think it's very likely we would have gotten it in another form at some other time.
Probably. Like, maybe released in some, like,
cycle.
Eventually when there's enough 3D Sonic games, it might have been thrown in as a extra, like, oh, never before released, the Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast in one of those, like, collection, like, through Sonic 3D collection sort of games. We might have seen it in one of those.
And, yeah, exactly. And like you said, I mean, like you said at the beginning, Sonic 3D Blast was commissioned as a failsafe in case of Sonic Xtreme's failure.
Right.
And so the game already exists. We're just saying, instead of failing, Xtreme succeeds. That doesn't change the fact that 3D Blast is still in development. And so I think it behooves Sega to not just let all of that development time go to waste and actually release the game at some point. So, but it would not have been released as early as it was. It would have been released later, most definitely. But I think it still probably would have been released. And honestly, it would have probably become even more niche than it is today. Because, of course, it would have been overshadowed by Xtreme, and very few people would have been exposed to it. And as a result, very few people would remember it. And it would just kind of fade into irrelevancy.
Yeah, it would be seen as like...
arguably did in our timeline, but even more so.
Yeah, I would say even more so, even more profoundly, for sure. Like, it would be just like this is how far Sonic has come in terms of 3D sort of thing, if anybody really even thinks about it. So, but anyway, I think that's about it. So, thank you all so much, everyone, for tuning in to this very in-depth discussion of a very niche topic, but one that has very interesting implications for video game history and pop culture writ large on the whole.
Most definitely. And it's a topic that's very unique for the A Fork in Time genre, but one that I think ended up being a pretty good episode, all things considered.
Yeah, I think so.
And
to address the other elephant in the room is that this was, I think, the first episode, which is only with Kai and I. We usually, if Kai's on a show, there's usually some combination of me and Dylan, or me and Chris and him. But Chris and Dylan decided to give us the keys to the ship, the keys to the kingdom this time. And hopefully we did not fail them. Hopefully they're not going to regret that decision.
It, given the nature of the topic and how far of a 90-degree turn we took. But nonetheless, I think it was a good episode and one worth archiving.
Yeah, I think so.
With that said, it would not be an aphid episode without us uttering the indelible refrain. When you find a fork in history, when you come across a fork in history, what, pray tell, should you do?
Render a 3D version of Green Hill Zone and gotta go fast straight through it.
Love it. Love the new direction that we're taking with the refrain. I think I interrupted you by saying the refrain, so before we head off, I'll let you finish that thought.
No, all good. I was actually preparing myself to end the episode, and so because I'm so used to doing it, when you started doing it, I'm like, oh, perfect, okay, I'm not doing it this time. But yeah, as it usually goes, if you stumble across a fork in time, what should we do with it? Well, I already gave that answer, but the typical answer is you should take it. Thank you all so much for listening, and let us know what you think on the Discord.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.